Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you here for our special mini conference that is now online only due to the snow, and with it being a snowstorm right now across unceded Mi'kmaq, all the more reason for us to be thinking about the housing crisis, housing insecurity, and how we can make better sense of this larger situation that is facing everyone here. So welcome to everyone. We want to begin with a land acknowledgement. In the bottom right, you will see the link placenames.mapdev.ca. That is an interactive map which allows you to know how to pronounce correctly the Indigenous names of where you are joining us from and where you are located. And I want to invite you to put in the chat where you are joining us from and to join with me in this land acknowledgement. But let's take a moment first to close our eyes and feel gratitude for this land where we are each joining from, and to reflect on the correct pre-colonial name for where you are joining us from. And perhaps you want to look at the window, seeing the beautiful snow outside, and perhaps there's a spot, a place on where you feel most connected to the land that you can feel grateful for. Maybe it's hiking trail or beach or your garden, but just take a moment for gratitude. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. So let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. And as we pause in gratitude, let us also pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share, by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. And when we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truths. We are all treaty people. So how does this impact what we do and how we do it? And how will it guide our work together today? The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treated. Decolonizing ourselves in our practice means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate, and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. Each of us, depending upon our social location and intersectional positionality are uniquely impacted or oppressed. For example, those of us from African descent were dispossessed and uprooted from their land and brought to Turtle Island against their will as part of the white supremacy and slave trade that fueled the settlement of this continent. We take this moment to reflect upon the unique impact of colonization upon each of us and upon our practice. And we commit to using our professional development to both learn new ways of thinking and understanding the work we do, and to unlearn assumptions and bias so that we can ensure safer social work practice and a more just world for all people. We are grateful for the new Canadian Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics that requires us to shift from the illusion of neutrality to actively becoming anti-racist and fighting against racism and all intersectional prejudice that is part of colonization. Social work understands public health and safety as including the psychosocial, spiritual, structural, and ecological determinants of health. And it is in this spirit that we are hosting this conference today. And we are grateful to the Nova Scotia Action Coalition for Community Wellbeing for partnering with us, and take this opportunity to highlight, if you're not familiar with them, you can find them online. The email is also located here, but they have Housing is Health, which is a special campaign. And that is something that, of course, aligns very strongly with our values and with our practice, which focuses upon the psychosocial structural determinants of health as part of understanding health and well-being. So today's conference is going to begin with the opportunity to have a bit of an overview around tenant rights and the housing crisis across Nova Scotia, which is to say unceded Mi'kmaq. And we're going to have a break, and then we're going to look at intersectional bias and housing insecurity. And then we're going to have a panel focused on fixed-term leases and the housing crisis. And then finally ending on a note of community mobilization and advocacy. So we're grateful to all of our speakers who are with us today. And of course, we were going to be at the library as well as virtual and have a hybrid conference. But given the snow and the fact that the province is shut down primarily today, we are only virtual. This is being recorded and it will be uploaded later to our YouTube channel if you're not able to join us for the whole day. We're grateful for what you can join us for. As the housing crisis worsens, there are easy short-term solutions and important longer-term solutions that we believe must be understood and considered. Many Nova Scotians are housing insecure and facing evictions, rising rents, and limited options for relocation. This issue is amplified as a result of intersectional bias and white supremacy, resulting in catastrophic consequences for historically marginalized communities. In order to support those in crisis, it is important to understand the larger context within which we are working and how to ensure the safety of all. And in the midst of a housing crisis, hundreds of thousands who rent are feeling the harmful impact of the increased use of fixed-term leases. This type of lease we're going to learn more about in the afternoon has become a loophole for landlords to exploit tenants, circumventing current interim rent control cap. And so our goal today is to understand the larger context of this issue and some of the advocacy opportunities that can help us to address the structural issues that impact the well-being of the communities we serve and support. We aim to shed light on the lack of tenant protection associated with these types of tenancies, the health complications, stress, and social exclusion that housing insecurity brings, and the importance of viewing housing not as a commodity, but as a basic human right that is intrinsic to health and safety. And we begin with having an opportunity to learn from Dr. Catherine Leviten-Reid, who is Associate Professor at Cape Breton University, and whose areas of expertise are specifically around affordable housing, community development, and nonprofit organizations. We are so grateful to have her here. Her work has been published widely, and her research on affordable housing makes her a really important voice to be helping us begin with a larger overview of this issue. And then we're going to have a chance to hear from Ray Paul, who works with the Youth Project. And there's actually a new role that is that Ray is filling that is specifically around 2S LGBTQIA+ housing. This is a new issue, and so we're grateful to have a chance to, afterwards, we will have a chance to learn from them as well. So stay tuned. Again, this is the schedule. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and we are going to have a chance to now hear from Catherine. So Catherine, thank you so very much for being with us today and helping us understand.
You are welcome, and I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, share screen, here we go. And current slide. I want to get rid of this. Okay, so can someone just confirm that they can see that?
So we see your slideshow with pictures of HRM and CBRM.
Okay.
So this is not your first slide, but it's...
Yeah, no, this
perfect.
is good. Okay. Yeah, okay, thanks so much, everyone. I also want to begin by acknowledging that I'm located in unceded Mi'kmaq territory. I'm sitting here in Unama'ki, Cape Breton Island, which means land of the fog. And I just wanted to begin, of course, by sharing with you some pictures of what the housing crisis is looking like in different communities across the province. These are different photos taken from the CBC website at different moments in time. But here we can see that this is not only an HRM issue. Of course, we have people experiencing homelessness, thousands of Nova Scotians experiencing homelessness right across the province. And of course, we have tens of thousands of Nova Scotians experiencing housing insecurity, having to make really impossible choices between whether or not to feed their children, put oil in their oil tank to keep themselves warm, pay their rent. And of course, they're living with this toxic stress of having to worry about whether or not they're going to have to lose their housing. So in this presentation this morning, just wanted to go over with you some of the root causes of the situation in which we find ourselves today. This is not normal. It's not natural for thousands and thousands of Nova Scotians to be without housing or experiencing really severe housing security. So how did we get there? So I want to start by discussing that. Then I also want to illustrate some of these root causes as far as how they're playing out with an example. And so I'm going to spend the last few minutes of the presentation this morning talking about the rent supplement program, because this is one of the major ways that our province is currently approaching the provision of affordable housing. And there are all kinds of limitations that with that approach with respect to tenant rights and with respect to really providing housing that's truly affordable for Nova Scotians. So it goes without saying that the housing insecurity and the homelessness that's being experienced across the province is not being experienced equally. There are all kinds of reasons for this. So Indigenous people, for example, lack land on which to build housing if they're on reserve. They lack incredible restrictions to generating own source revenue to build housing. off-reserve Indigenous housing is underfunded. And of course, Indigenous people experience discrimination in multiple facets of their lives. The same is true for people who are members of racialized communities, discrimination, and they are more likely to experience mass evictions. So if you look back in time, you see mass evictions due to urban redevelopment. And now you actually see it due to redevelopment on the part of the private for-profit sector. So when you have mass rent evictions, large buildings or complexes that are being renovated, redeveloped. These are typically members of racialized communities who are experiencing mass evictions. Women, of course, are more likely to be responsible for child care provision, for elder care provision, and they, of course, experience intimate partner violence. Individuals who identify as 2S, LGBTQ+, or LGBTQIA+, experience violence, social services that aren't accommodating to them, and in which they often feel like they don't belong. And of course, people with disabilities encounter multiple barriers in the labor market. They experience so many barriers when they're trying to find housing. Much of our housing is not built for them. And of course, they face really limited income assistance. So all of these root causes are at play here when we're looking at our crises of affordable housing and homelessness. Also at play is neoliberalism. And so what does this mean? This means that government over time has reduced the role that it has played in providing a social safety net to all of us. And so what happens with neoliberalism is that the approach is, well, we're not going to have government do it, the market's going to take care of this instead. And so we as individuals and households and families are given the responsibility of meeting our own needs. And we do this by buying things that are available through the marketplace, buying goods and services, buying our housing, looking for a place to rent that's of reasonable cost, within our means and is of good quality. So the burden is very much placed on us, and we're told that we have to take more responsibility for ourselves. We have to earn our income. If we can't find a job, we have to start our own business. And the message is really, we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and take care of our own needs. That's not the role of government. And so we see this playing out in all kinds of different ways. You folks see this, I'm sure, more in your day-to-day than I do, given your work on the front lines. But an example is very low income assistance rates and income assistance rates that are not indexed to inflation. The message is that folks who can't work, well, they have to take responsibility for themselves. They actually have to wait to figure out, they have to find out on their own how they're going to make ends meet. I think there are all kinds of other examples of this too when we look at what's going on with housing and homelessness. So I think that, the conversations that are going on right now about people who are living in encampments, we're really placing the blame on them. You're in an encampment because you're not going to a shelter and connecting with a social worker. And that social worker is going to help you find housing. There's no acknowledgement there of the structural causes of our homelessness crisis, no acknowledgement of the structural causes of making it so that people cannot afford to live in rental housing anywhere in the province. Another example, and this is something that the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers taught me, is how neglect is defined in the Children and Family Services Act. So that's also placing the burden of providing adequate housing on the household or the family. So again, there's no acknowledgement of the structural issues, no acknowledgement that there are reasons why we have got our housing in need of major repair on the market, because housing isn't, landlords aren't licensed, housing isn't inspected. And also, again, we have very low income assistance rates, which means it's so difficult for households to buy the good quality housing that they need through the marketplace. So neoliberalism is also very much at play here in explaining why we have this crisis here in the province. So this is playing out in other ways as well. And so again, this is contextual information that I'm providing to you because I hope it's going to help you understand where we are today. There's been a real lack of investment in social housing, and this has been going on for over 30 years now. And so I want to break this down, I guess, into two different parts. So social housing means something really specific. Social housing means deeply subsidized housing that's provided not through the marketplace, but through government, so in the form of public housing, and also through the nonprofit and cooperative sectors. So in the early 1990s, the federal government pulled back with respect to the role it played in supporting the construction of new social housing. And when they did so, the province of Nova Scotia didn't step up in response. So we had a long period there. We had decades in which we didn't have a leader, financing the construction of new social housing. If you look at what happened across the country, many provinces were similar to Nova Scotia, but there were provinces that actually stepped up and played a stronger role in response to the government pulling out. So examples include Quebec, Ontario did for a brief period of time, and British Columbia did as well. So you have this, vacuum, no one generating social housing in our province for a period of over 30 years. Currently, the provincial plan has really modest targets for new, deeply affordable social housing. So the announcement in the fall was 222 units of public housing. Meanwhile, just in Cape Breton Regional Municipality, we have 1,200 households waiting for a unit of public housing. And province-wide, we have over 5,000 households waiting for a unit of public housing. And the same thing goes with the National Housing Strategy. So back to the federal government, if you look at what the federal government has proposed to spend on social housing through the National Housing Strategy, it's been mostly on repairs, which is important, making some of the housing more accessible, and also doing energy retrofits to some of this housing. So that's absolutely important. Those investments are needed, but we're not seeing investments in new social housing that we desperately need. And then related to this is that there's been a shift in terms of how affordable housing is defined. And so it's possible you've seen some of this come up in the news every once in a while. So while we used to build housing that was 30% of a tenant's income on rent, that was maximum. We have public housing units in the province where it's 25% of a tenant's income on rent. That used to be the way government built affordable housing. But now they're saying, okay, you can build affordable housing and we consider it affordable as long as you don't charge 80% of median market rent or more. So that means that if you have a neighborhood, say in Dartmouth, where the median market rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $1,000, and it's surely higher than that, but I'm using $1,000 because the math is easier. So you have the neighborhood in Dartmouth where median market rent is $1,000. It means that as long as the developer charges $799 per month in rent, that housing is considered affordable. But you folks all know that $799 is almost the same as what an individual gets if they are in receipt of income assistance. So that is not affordable housing, but we've seen this really dramatic shift in how affordability is being defined. So we also see a lack of emphasis on nonprofit and cooperative housing in the province, and I can't stress how important this is. So our nonprofit and cooperative housing sectors are really small in Nova Scotia. And there isn't an emphasis on the part of government when they're awarding funds to this community housing sector. So this means that almost all of our rental housing stock is owned by the private for-profit sector. So that's really important when we're thinking about tenant rights. So I have a lot I want to say during this slide, but I know that some of you are going to say, well, wait a second, Catherine, you've got this a little bit wrong, and fair enough. This sector changes so quickly, it's really hard for me to keep up to date. But you know, it's true that yes, the government has supported the development of the Nova Scotia nonprofit housing sector, and there are capacity grants available for nonprofit and cooperative providers. That's really important, and folks have done excellent work getting that association off the ground, again with government support. But my point here is that we're not privileging these sectors. So much of the affordable housing being built in the province, and this has gone on for the past 20 years, is through the private for-profit sector. If you look back in time, you do see at different periods a deliberate partnership with the nonprofit and cooperative sectors. And if you look in different parts of the economy, you see deliberate partnerships as well. So an example is in the province of Quebec. About 20 years ago, when the social economy, so nonprofit and cooperative organizations, were really strong, there was a deliberate partnership between the provincial government and those organizations to develop home support services, because they realized that with an aging population, home support services were needed across the province to help people age in place. So the government didn't say, okay, let's get the for-profit sector to do this. They were like, we are going to deliberately partner with the nonprofit and cooperative sectors to get that done. So it is possible to have these deliberate partnerships. So here we are. We are in a situation where about 89% of all of our rental housing is provided through the private for-profit marketplace. So think about that. We all know on this call that housing is a key social determinant of health. So this is where we, this is where we do our homework. This is where we prepare meals. This is where we invite people over, or this is where we, take refuge if we want to get away from harmful people in our social networks. Housing is so important, but it's being provided through the private for-profit sector. So the last thing I just want to talk about with this slide is that if you look at the research on a housing provider type and different kinds of tenant outcomes and experiences, you also see that it really matters. So I've actually done research in this area. I've done 2 different research projects, one where I compared 3 different housing developments in rural Nova Scotia, all for seniors, all created through the same funding mechanisms, all small, so 24 units or less. One was nonprofit, one was co-op, one was for-profit. How are they different? I also did extensive survey research just among rental housing providers in Cape Breton Regional Municipality, and I looked at data on the rents that they were charging and how they're different. There's been quite a bit of research in the United States on a housing provider type. And I also have a colleague of mine at the University of Saskatchewan who's done work on evictions and rental housing type. So what do we know from that body of work? We know that nonprofits and cooperatives charge lower rents. We know that they involve tenants in decision-making, and this is particularly true in the case of cooperatives. And so this is important, in thinking about tenant rights. Nonprofits and cooperatives also have stronger social orientations. So that means different things, more likely to have common space, like common rooms, for people to meet their family members, for nonprofits to organize different services to be delivered inside that common space. Nonprofits are more likely to locate in distressed neighborhoods where, there's less of a business case, but there's need for affordable housing. So you're going to see nonprofits locate there. nonprofits are more likely to keep their rents affordable after agreements with government expires. So, you know, typically these days, if you win, you know, a secure financing through a government program, they're going to say, okay, you have to make that housing affordable for 20 years. What happens after those 20 years? Well, American research has shown that nonprofits will keep their rents affordable and for-profits tend to increase them. And then my colleague Sarah Bueller has found that as far as evictions go in the city of Saskatoon, you see evictions occurring predominantly in the for-profit sector, and particularly with financialized landlords. So really important. Another thing going on as far as explaining where we are today. Neoliberalism, not investing in social housing, not deliberately partnering with the nonprofit and cooperative sectors, but public housing has been you know, considered and to be quote unquote bad housing. Of course, I would never say that, but you hear this in conversations. You know, you hear this, I think, between the lines if you're reading different policy documents. And it's funny, I do a number of media interviews and I'm often asked, you know, okay, so given this crisis situation that we're in, you know, what's one thing that we could do? What's one thing the government could do to really make a dent in this crisis? And I always say we need to invest in non-market housing, public housing, and nonprofit and cooperative housing. And typically, the person I'm talking to will say, wow, really, Catherine? Investing in public housing, a massive investment in public housing, but isn't that bad housing? That housing has all kinds of problems. But, you know, does it, or has it just come to be like that? Is public housing actually an ideal model through which to deliver housing in this province? But it's been labeled as bad housing. So I'll just go over a couple of examples here. You know, one is that, well, public housing is of poor quality, and you hear incredible stories in the media of poor insulation, housing in need of major repair, mold. I hear locally about infestations, and we can't deny that there are problems with the quality of public housing given these reports. But is that really due to the model, or is that because we haven't had adequate investment in public housing over time? There are examples around the world of beautiful public housing providing deeply affordable housing for people in need. And then a second example I'll share with you, you know, given the emphasis of the day on tenant rights, is public housing is poorly managed. And absolutely, if you've read the Auditor General's reports, because there's been more than one over the past decade, you will come away and say, wow, you know, poor management. But I think if you read between the lines there, you're also going to see that there were serious staffing issues across the housing authorities in this province. So again, lack of investment, but also you don't have tenant engagement that is supported. So when we had our 5 housing authorities, and then before that, there were even more housing authorities, you had spots reserved on the boards for tenants, but they were rarely filled, and these were appointed positions. You didn't have tenants electing representatives. And again, if you look at public housing in other parts of the country, you're going to see much more active tenant engagement in public housing in places like Montreal and places like Toronto. So is public housing really inherently poorly managed, or has it lacked, for example, tenant engagement because we haven't invested in it? And it's noteworthy actually that tenant engagement is not part of the new public housing approach, that the new, you know, the one authority, the name of it is is not coming to me. But in any case, when our local housing authorities were turned into the one organization, it wasn't followed with any kind of investment in tenant engagement at all. So again, important when we're thinking about tenant rights, part of this neoliberal approach is not wanting to regulate. So either pulling back or not intervening. So if you look at the literature, the research on nonprofit and for-profit sectors kind of behaving in the same marketplace, some people say that actually they start to behave more similarly if you have regulation in place that pushes them, that forces them to behave similarly. And there's a term for this in the literature. It's called coercive isomorphism. But that's what regulation can do. If you're really restricted as an organization or provider with respect to what you can do, you're going to start to behave more like how we see nonprofits behaving. And there are examples of this in different places. And one is in the delivery of childcare services. So often, depending on the province or the state, in the case of the United States, you have for-profit childcare businesses offering services in the same community as nonprofit childcare providers. But you have legislation and regulation in place which really constrains how the for-profit childcare providers can operate. And then you have government doing annual inspections of these childcare agencies and publishing any problems that they find with these childcare providers to help us make decisions about the organization that we want to buy our childcare services from. So in Nova Scotia, when you're thinking about how we can get the private for-profit sector to behave more like the small number of nonprofit housing providers we have, this could include introducing vacancy control. So this is not introducing permanent rent control. This is a step further. Vacancy control means that when a tenant leaves the unit, the landlord is not allowed to increase rent by whatever amount they want to, which is currently allowed in the province. So it means that rent control is tied to the unit and not to the people living in the unit. This could also mean having licenses for all of our landlords, which would involve having regular inspections of rental housing units, having enforcement officers in place and not allowing fixed term leases. So, the other thing going on here is that housing is considered an asset. It's not considered as a right. So different levels of government emphasize home ownership, and they do it in different ways. A rebate when you build a new home. We have a really incredible home buyer program in the sense that it allows people to set aside some of their income on which they don't pay taxes. And then when they withdraw that amount of money to buy their first home, they also don't pay tax on that income. And cap property assessments, right? So in Nova Scotia, if you're a homeowner, I'm a homeowner, I have this benefit of a capped property assessment. Meanwhile, we don't, rent control is hugely controversial, right? So why would we consider having a rent control or vacancy control, which would limit the increases that renters experience across this province? But homeowners have this privilege of this capped property assessment. And related to housing being an asset is that we don't have mechanisms in place to curb the financialization of housing across the province. So one big one there is short-term rental housing. So in Cape Breton Regional Municipality, you can absolutely turn your rental unit into a short-term rental. Our municipality hasn't done anything to curb that. So why can't we have the province take a meaningful role here and do something similar to what they did in British Columbia, restrict short-term rentals, although I would say you would need to do it in rural areas as well as more urban ones. So, just last, before I start talking a little bit about rent supplements, and I know I've talked for a while already, and I know it's really hard to listen to these, these long presentations online. I wasn't sure what to call this slide. I really struggled with it. I'm not sure how many of you have read the new book by the person who wrote Evicted, Matthew Desmond, on poverty in the United States, and how Americans have created poverty and how it really benefits people who have higher incomes. And his last chapter is on, we've settled on resource scarcity, like we've settled on believing that there is resource scarcity, but is there really? So I could have, call it something like that, but I decided to call it, settling on the mediocre. So we just have such modest targets for affordable housing interventions. Really piecemeal investments have become the norm. And we really need to ask ourselves, why can't our goal be to eliminate homelessness and make sure that every Nova Scotian is living in affordable, safe, secure, and good quality housing? So I just want to end the presentation by just sharing with you a little bit of research that I've done on rent supplements. I've been doing research on rent supplements now for about 3.5 years. And I just wanted to share this with you because, again, it's one of the main ways that the provincial government is currently intervening with respect to housing affordability in this province. And it's also actually one of the main approaches of the federal government. And you can see that through the National Housing Strategy. So the research that I'm going to share with you involves interviews with tenants here in CBRM, as well as interviews with some housing support workers. And so I met with tenants and housing support workers, and I asked them questions related to affordability, security of tenure, housing condition, their social support networks. And this is some of what I found. So receiving a rent supplement does help tenants pay for the rent and have money for other necessities. And so this isn't surprising, right? So if the government provides low-income renters with some financial support, they should have an easier time paying their rent. And so someone said to me, with subsidy, for me, rent is cheaper. And another tenant I met shared with me, that saves me $195 from the income assistance check, right? That's a grocery order. But I found that the tenants I interviewed are still paying far more than they should be on their shelter. So this is odd, right? So they're getting a rent supplement, and the idea is to help Nova Scotians with affordable housing, but they're still paying far more than they should be on shelter, more than 50% of their income for many of the tenants I interviewed. So one person said to me, and I thought this summed up the situation really well. He said, it makes the difference between being able to barely make it or not make it at all. So here we have this program where folks are barely making it, even though they're supposed to be helped with their housing situations. So what's going on there? Why are recipients of rent supplements still paying more than they should be for their shelter? One reason is that if utilities aren't included in their rent, they're responsible for paying all of them. So, I interviewed someone in the wintertime in her home, and she said to me, I don't want to turn on the heat. You can see from that excerpt there, she says it's pretty cold out right now, though. And someone else said to me, my energy bill is way too expensive right now. And we know that almost all of the units in Nova Scotia don't have all utilities included. We know that from research I've done in CBRM, where I found that, 9% of our rental units don't even have water included. But we also know that from the Canadian Housing Survey data. which is national, which has a lot of data from the province of Nova Scotia. Tenants are responsible by and large for their utilities. And the programs that are out there just aren't enough to cover tenants' energy costs. But the other big thing going on here with respect to the rent supplement program is that if you are living in a unit that costs more than average market rent, you're responsible for covering what's above average market rent on your own. So the way the rent supplement program works is that it bridges the gap between 30% of your income and average market rent. So say your household income in a month is $1,000. So the province says, well, okay, you're only supposed to be paying 30% of your income on rent. So we're bridging the gap between $300, because that's 30% of income, your income, and average market rent. So in the case of Sydney, for a 1-bedroom, average market rent is $759. So that means that the province would provide you $459 in a rent subsidy, but you'd have to pay anything else above that on your own, plus your utility bills. And as people told me, and this is second quote there, that quote there is from a housing support worker. You know, she said, I can't find anything under $1,000. And so here you see the average market rent chart, and you can just take a quick look there, see where you live, and see what the average market rent figures are compared to what's actually going on in your community. I also asked, like I said earlier, about housing condition. Some tenants reported living in housing in good condition. Like this person said to me, you know, this place is one of the nicest places I've ever lived in. But I also interviewed people who were living in housing really that needed major repair. So one person said to me, I've got 4 windows in my apartment. 3 of them are beat out. I treat my dog better than that. I don't know how to explain it. You'd have to see it with your own eyes. And another person, and I interviewed her in her own home, in her own rental. And she said to me, I know it needs a lot of work. If you look over there, there's a hole up in the ceiling where the poles are the pipes. The landlord's going to fix that eventually. This is a tenant who I interviewed twice. So I went back about 9 months later. There was a disruption because of COVID, and the repairs still hadn't been done. And I asked about security of tenure. Findings were mixed. Some tenants said they felt they had really good relationships with their landlords, but others had different experiences. So here's one where someone said to me, complain too much, you get evicted, they move the students in. So what do you do? And this is someone who was living in housing in need of major repair. So how does this major program available to help Nova Scotians with affordable housing really reflect a neoliberal approach? And you know, one of the structural causes of the crisis that we're in the first place. It's clear they rely predominantly on the private sector. So it's no longer public housing or, you know, nonprofit and cooperative housing. It's the private sector delivering this housing with some cash assistance provided to tenants. They help tenants with shelter costs, but they're not resulting in affordable housing. This is not deeply subsidized social housing. Remember, I talked earlier on about that shift. You know, now the government defines affordable as 80% of median market rent. Well, the same thing is happening with rent supplements. They're help, but they're not resulting in affordable housing. Really important too is that they're assuming we are tenants who are consumers. We are rational actors. We have full information about the rental housing market, and we can go out there and we can choose housing that's being rented at average market rent, and that's of good quality. There's no acknowledgement of those structural factors really causing housing in need of major repair to be on the market, and real limitations with respect to the amount of lower cost rental housing that's available for rent. So that assumption is built right into the rent supplement program. You'll often see, you know, when people are pointing out the benefits of the rent supplement program, they'll say, well, tenants have choice. That's truly only theoretical. when they don't have anywhere to move. What's really important too is that our new rent supplement program has removed elements that were in place to protect tenants. And so when I was doing my field work, when I was interviewing tenants, I ended up interviewing some tenants who were still receiving the old rent supplement program. The current rent supplement program that we've had in place since 2020 replaces older rent supplement programs, and it's designed differently. And in those old rent supplement programs, there was actually an agreed upon rent. So the province wasn't using average market rent as the cutoff for the subsidy. The landlord could charge something above that as long as the public housing authority said that it was okay. You know, it still had to be modest housing. It had to be in keeping with the rental market, but it was still okay for it to be above average market rent. And the province actually covered that portion above average market rent as well. But the other important thing that was part of the old rent supplement program, and it's not part of this new one, the Canada Nova Scotia Targeted Housing Benefit, is that unit inspections were involved as well. So there are some exceptions. So if you're working with the housing support worker, you'd have a unit inspection done now, but those old rent supplements, there were inspections done. And so arguably, you know, this is neoliberalism at play again, the government, you know, removing those protective elements. And really importantly for the session today is that the rent supplement program hasn't been accompanied by changes to the private rental market that work for tenants, that provide them with more protections. So it hasn't been followed by permanent rent control, but vacancy control. It hasn't been followed with landlord licensing across the province, which would involve unit inspections, which would make it so that people weren't renting housing in need of major repair. It hasn't been followed by ending fixed term leases, and it hasn't been followed by other tenant protections. So I actually have a couple more slides here, but I cannot go page down. And so I'm going to interpret that as me being out of time. Is that right, Nash? Am I out of time?
You are not exactly out of time. There are, however, multiple comments and questions, of course.
Okay.
Great discussions and dialogue. But
Perfect.
the one question that's coming up repeatedly is the average monthly rent. How is it determined? Why hasn't it been adjusted? Why is it average market rent but not average advertised rent? So there's a lot of comments and questions about that.
Yep, that's great. So I'm going to stop there. You know, I had a slide about strengthening the rent supplement program. I wrote a blog that was published through the CCPA NS in the summer, so we can share that. And
it actually has been shared in the chat. So
perfect. So I just want to add one thing, and then I'm going to answer questions. You know, the other thing is that, again, this is not social housing, and so really we need to change the rent supplement program in the short term so it works better for tenants. We need to change the rental market so tenants have protections when they're receiving rent supplements. But we also have to massively invest in social housing. And that's, you know, from me and the, you know, 12 years of research I've been doing on the housing sector, but it's also right from the data. It's from folks I interviewed, housing support workers, tenants, and also a second research project that I did on rent supplements here in Nova Scotia and also in Newfoundland and Labrador and New Brunswick. I'm going to stop there. And so, yeah, thanks for your, thanks everyone for sharing your time with me. And so I'm going to jump right into the average market rent table. And I can't even go back to that table. What is going on? Oh, okay. All right. It's funny. So where does this data come from? So this data is based on the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation rental market survey that they do once every fall. So they do the survey in the fall, then that data becomes public in January or February of that following year, so about 3 months later. And then at some point after that, the provincial government will implement those rates as average market rent. And so these underestimate the true cost of rental housing for different reasons. One is because they include rents that are based on occupied units, but also vacant units. So just think about it, my math is horrible, but think about it. If you were just doing a survey of units that were vacant, you would end up with a much higher average than if you were doing a survey on units that were occupied. And that's because of a lack of vacancy control in the province, right? So if landlords can increase rent on an unoccupied unit by whatever amount, you're going to see much higher averages in unoccupied units, but that isn't reflected well in the CMHC data. And indeed, in larger communities, sometimes you see CMHC publishing average market rents for unoccupied units, and you see a dramatic difference between unoccupied and occupied. I believe that data exists for Halifax, maybe for last year or the year before. So that's one of the reasons. Another one of the reasons is that they don't, in smaller communities, it doesn't reflect secondary rental market data, which is, like duplexes for rent or entire homes for rent. When CMHC collects data here in CBRM, they totally ignore all of those rentals. And that's half of our rental housing stock. And those rental units I found when I was doing my research about 8 years ago here, the survey research I did, especially for larger, like 2 and 3 bedroom units, our secondary market is more expensive than our primary market, and that's not reflected in the data. So why doesn't the province bridge the gap between 30% of a tenant's income and the actual rent charged by the landlord? That's an excellent question. Why don't they? And when you're talking about advocacy, you're talking about tenant protections, that's something that you could include as far as advocating for. So, you could say, well, why don't we, if there's a financial reason here for the government to implement not permanent rent control, but vacancy control, because it's going to make your rent supplement program work better, right? But if you're not going to do that, you need to be bridging the gap between 30% of a tenant's income and the actual rent they're paying. So the National Housing Council, which is a body that oversees the implementation of the National Housing Strategy, they have done a number of, or had consulting firms do a number of research reports for them on different elements of the National Housing Strategy. And in the report that they produced this spring, that is one of the recommendations they made, that for this rent supplement program and across the country to really work for low-income tenants, it needs to bridge that full gap between 30% of income and the tenant's rent. And that makes it like public housing, right? It turns it into a form of deeply subsidized housing, which still has problems because it's provided through the marketplace. But you do that and you increase tenant protections, you start to see a better kind of housing delivered through the private for-profit sector. So I'm not sure if I answered all the questions related to the average market rents.
I think you definitely helped us begin to understand a little more. I think we could probably spend the next month trying to dive deeper in and still not understand how it is that we are in the mess that we are in. There's some great conversation and dialogue in the chat. One question also in the Q&A for you around a reference for the government paying 80%. So there was like just a couple of questions, and this is a reminder to people, if you're here live, you get to engage in some great dialogue and discussion. But I think in terms of our conference, we're probably at the end of our time. So I don't know if there's any closing words that you wanted to share with us. And then you can probably respond on the chat or in the question and answer to any people.
Okay, sure. And I'm happy, you know, folks can email me as well. And I'm happy to answer questions. And if you folks are interested in a session, you know, that goes into more detail around the rent supplement program, we could talk about that as well at some point, just working
I
out
will
more
be
technical
delighted to
issues.
follow up with you. Thank you
Okay.
so much for that.
Okay, thanks so much.
So we will be having a small break.